Hi, everyone. Welcome in. We're just going to let some folks just kind of trickle in as we get folks, and we'll start in a few minutes. Feel free to hang out. We'll ask everyone to just remain muted. You also, are welcome to have your video on, or you can turn it off, whatever you want. We just unfortunately don't have the webinar setting for our Zoom. So we're all in a big, lovely, cozy meeting together. All right. So I hope everyone is enjoying your, God, what day is it? Thursday? Is it Thursday?
Thursday confirmed.
Time is no longer real to me. I think that it's both simultaneously no longer real and also all too present. But yeah, welcome in everybody. We'll give just a couple minutes for a couple more folks to pop in, and then we'll get started. While we're waiting for folks, wanted to get a read from the folks that we have in here. Has everybody gotten a chance to watch all three of the films? Any immediate kind of thoughts you want to share? Excited? What was your experience watching them?
I want to say that my co-producer just got online, Fred Johnson. So he's co-produced all the films with me, so
Wonderful.
for which I'm grateful.
Right. Welcome. All right. So let's see. So, what we'll be doing tonight is we're gonna have a conversation, and then between our lovely panelists, and then we will open it up to questions from the audience. We have a Q&A feature here on Zoom, so you should be able to submit a question via the Q&A little feature. I believe you should have a little Q&A button on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can type in a question. And if you see a question that somebody has asked and you really want that one to be asked, you can upvote it, you can like it, you can suggest to others that that's the one that we want. If you would like to ask your question verbally off of off mute, feel free to just click that little ask to unmute button, and we'll unmute you and get you up on the mic so that you can ask a question or share your thoughts or comments that way as well. But we are just about at 5:05, so we'll just get started. So welcome to everyone. My name is Lee Pfeffer. I use they, them pronouns, and I'm the Senior Manager of Museum Experience at the GLBT Historical Society in San Francisco. I am so glad that everyone is joining us, and I've been so excited to do this month-long program with the Faulkner-Morgan Archive and Media Working Group this month for LGBTQ History Month, and being able to highlight these stories that don't always get shared or showcased because so much of LGBTQ history focus is on areas like San Francisco, like New York, LA, these kind of more metropolitan coastal areas. And so it's my pleasure to introduce the folks that are going to be speaking tonight. I'll be your moderator. So we have Jonathan Coleman. I'll spotlight or pin you right here. There you go. So Jonathan is co-founder and president of Faulkner-Morgan Archive, a nonprofit with a mission to share Kentucky's LGBTQ history. He was the James Still Fellow at the University of Kentucky, earning his doctorate in history in 2014. And he often lectures on queer history and was a consultant for the Kentucky LGBT History Initiative, funded by the NPS, National Park Service. Dr. Coleman is also the executive director of the Bluegrass Trust for Historic Preservation. And so I'm sure we will talk about that and a little bit about, that kind of intersection of that work as well. And then next up, we also have Jean Donohue, who is our lovely filmmaker for tonight. So Jean is a documentary maker, writer, and traveler. Her films are about land, culture, and what it means to be human in relation to the natural world. Much of her work is about people whose lives, situations, and thinking illuminate a path through the challenges of living in the 21st century. Things like globalization, climate change, human rights. Donohue has been producing video art and documentaries since the early 80s, and her work has been seen on BBC Two, BBC World Service, Independent Lens, POV, WNet New York, Learning Discovery channels, and public television throughout the whole country. Her latest films, which we are focusing on tonight, and we have been doing this Queer History Month, known affectionately as the Queer Trilogy, so Last Gospel of the Pagan Babies, Under the Southern Cross, and Native Daughter, C.D. Collins' A Reckoning, have been screened at film festivals throughout Europe and the US, and just had, what is it, earlier this week, or was it last week, that you had your, the premiere of Native Daughter in Kentucky. So congratulations. And as a media educator, Donohue has worked for the International Institute for Capacity Building in Africa, in Ethiopia and Uganda, training educators on how to integrate HIV/AIDS prevention across the curriculum using digital media. Donohue is a founding member of Media Working Group, a nonprofit media education and production organization, and these films would not be possible without them. And then lastly, we have my colleague here, Molly June Roquet, who has been in library and archives leadership for over a decade. Most recently, she served as the Assistant Library Director for Public Services and Research Support at the California Institute of Integral Studies. Molly holds a BA in History from San Francisco State and a Master's in Library and Information Science from Wayne State University. A lifelong queer and trans history nerd and inveterate researcher, Molly is thrilled and honored to steward the incredible collection and to collaborate with the fantastic people at the Historical Society. I grabbed your bio from when you joined us, so some of that is just kind of sprinkled in there.
Still
and
true.
The broader community, yeah, still true. And outside of work, Molly's a musician. Speaking of punk fun punk anarcho communities, Molly, you can catch playing drums with the Homobiles and Maggie Gently. So welcome to everyone. I am so excited to have this conversation with everyone. So I'm going to add pins for everybody here. Okay, and there we go. So for anyone who wasn't in here when I was explaining these, we'll go through. I've got a couple of questions that I'll be asking these folks to kind of steer our conversation, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions from the audience. So feel free to use that Q&A button. You can also feel free to drop whatever you'd like in the chat. Would be happy to see folks interacting in there. But I just wanted to start off the conversation by, asking each of the three of you. I did some long bios for each of you, but I would love for you each to just do a real quick, introduction in your own words about how you got into this work and, what drives you in these areas. Let's see. Oh, popcorn. We'll do Jonathan first.
Oh, thanks for having us, Lee. So I guess I got into LGBTQ history really as part of a process of my own coming out. That's sort of where I just naturally turned to. I remember my first sort of I mean, how stereotypical, but it was Oscar Wilde reading the big old biography of Oscar, and then sort of translating into other stories and then more local stories. So I ended up at the University of Kentucky working on my PhD in modern Britain, interested in questions of gender and sexuality. I had lived in London for a while. And so, but quickly, I'm a native Kentuckian. My family has been here for about 7 generations now. And so all of these stories that I had heard, both within Great Britain and across the States, I quickly learned was happening right here in Kentucky. They simply needed to be highlighted. And it was through that kind of academic interest that I got interested in local history. And it was actually through Jean's first film in the trilogy, Last Gospel of the Pagan Babies, that I really got to meet Bob Morgan. And together we founded the Faulker-Morgan Archive, really as an accident. I'd be happy to talk about that story as we go on. Really as an accident, like just a private personal endeavor to make sure the things that were featured in the film, that those materials continued to exist. And it has now grown into quite the endeavor. It has its own full-time employees now, and we have well over 15,000 or so objects within the archive, hundreds of hours of recorded interviews that have been used across the nation and around the world, and has even been used in Jean's future films. So it's nice for there to be that kind of full circle moment.
Fantastic. Jean, we can go to you next.
Well, I lived in Lexington when a lot of the Pagan Babies stuff was going on, and the punk music scene was happening, and I knew Bob in the late 70s, and he was, I mean, he was kind of the whirlwind. He was the focus of a lot of people's attention around art and underground culture and gay culture. And we were friends. I was not in the inner circle. I was kind of a young photographer, kind of bumbling around and meeting people. But Bob and I were friends, and he left for Florida at some point in the early 80s, or maybe mid 80s. And I moved away. I went to live near Cincinnati, and we hadn't seen each other for 30 years. And I ran into him. I had moved to Boston, and I was back in Lexington to visit family, and ran into Bob on the street. It was Day of the Dead, and he had a huge altar at the University of Kentucky Gallery, and we we sat and talked for hours, kind of catching up. And I was asking questions about what happened to this person and what happened to that person, and listening to Bob's what had happened in the last 30 years. And it was such an astonishing story. Of course, Bob is a great storyteller, but his personal journey was so harrowing, and also joyful and filled with art, but also grief. And so I talked to him about making a film about his life. That's what I was really intending on doing. And so we got into conversations. He said, well, it can't be just about me. It's got to be about Sweet Evening Breeze. It's got to be about Henry. It's got to be, Bradley Picklesheimer. And I agreed, because having moved away to the Northeast and other places, when you try to describe what it was like coming of age in Lexington in the late 70s and 80s, people didn't believe me. And they said that can't happen. That couldn't have happened. I mean, a lot of people don't even believe that there are gay people in Kentucky. And and in talking to other people that I knew that had moved away, they had had the same experiences. People didn't believe what a great time it was. I mean, it was an amazing it was kind of like the New York downtown scene, but in rural, in a small town in Kentucky. I mean, it was great. And if you've watched Last of the Gospel of the Pagan Babies, you can see the influence of, the narco farm and the gay bars. And so that's how it kind of came about. I just thought, well, this was during, George W. Bush's presidency, and everybody was mad at Kentucky and for electing these right-wing Republicans and stuff. And I thought, they don't know anything about us. And so I just decided to make this film. And and after finishing Pagan Babies, John had gotten into, archiving Bob's collection, but he was really delving into the life of Henry Faulkner. And he kept he kept finding things that made Henry's life a little bit larger. And I realized that I had not treated Henry as well as could have been. His life was much larger and influential, and he was part of the kind of the Southern intelligentsia in New York in the 1940s and 50s, and nobody knew this. So that's why I decided to do Under the Southern Cross. It was because of John. But a Native Daughter, I had been working on, while I was working on Pagan Babies, I had been working on Native Daughter, and it took a long time, one, because of course you have to raise your own money to do these things, but CD's life was so complex and so buried. I mean, a lot of her memory and feelings about her life were so buried that it just took forever for me to figure out what was really important, because she was this, she was a writer, she's a farmer, but it just took me a long time to kind of get the thread of her life. And I still don't think I got it all, because she told me the other day, she said, well, my father was part of the team that was visiting Japan after we dropped the bomb in Hiroshima. It's like, you didn't say this. I didn't, it didn't occur to me that he could have had a role in the aftermath of our dropping bombs in Japan. So anyway, so that's kind of how it went with Sherry. And so.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. That was going to be, part of one of my questions for you was, how you got started on each of the projects, etc. So this is a great little intro. And then we'll go to Molly.
Yeah, thanks, Lee, and so honored to be here with Jonathan and with Jean tonight. Yeah, in the bio you read, Lee, you described me as an inveterate researcher. I wrote that bio, but it's true, and that is really how I found myself as a queer archivist. Like Jonathan mentioned, it was sort of, for me, part of my coming out process and my sort of multiple coming out processes. And as a young person in like middle school, high school, especially like middle school, I would beg my parents to take me to San Francisco. I grew up in a town outside Sacramento, so about an hour from the Bay Area. And San Francisco felt like this sort of wonderland of queerness and of sort of visible queerness that I could like feel in the streets. And as I sort of learned, the sort of first things you learn about San Francisco gay history, Harvey Milk and so on, just found myself pulled toward that, in part as a way to understand myself and sort of my relationship to this place that I felt without sort of knowing exactly what it meant. And I moved to San Francisco a month after my 18th birthday to go to school there. San Francisco State was sort of the choice for the city more than the college, and sort of threw myself into both the history of the city as a history major, and doing a lot of sort of urban studies and urban planning history as well, which and the ways that comes into play and in both the history of any number of marginalized communities in San Francisco and the history of sort of how those communities have been marginalized through land use and housing and policing and public policy. And what else do I want to say? This work is really meaningful to me and feels like it is beyond just sort of there's something about being in our vault that feels magical to me. It's 100 years of gay history in San Francisco, and it is a way. Um, it sort of offers an endless number of ways for us to understand ourselves in the present moment, in lots of ways that we haven't even sort of thought of yet, but that are sort of they're waiting for us. And in this particular moment, that feels just incredibly important to me. So I sort of continue to approach this work with that spirit of curiosity and wanting to know things and always sort of wanting to know the next story. I love the how Jean was just talking about sort of wanting to like realizing there was sort of more to say about Henry and that he was such a big person and such a big life. And it's incredible watching that film and seeing that. And I think that that's sort of there in so many stories that once we sort of start following these threads, there's just always more to say and more to discover that leads you to sort of a greater understanding that um, of ourselves and of our history and of our people. And it's funny because, I was sort of describing this pull towards San Francisco, and in some ways, I think the like premise of this evening for us at the GLBT Historical Society is that people sort of look to San Francisco, New York, LA as like that's gay history in the United States, and of course it's not. And that's almost, been a learning for me and a thing I sort of continue to think about in my own work, the way that the cities have come to represent something in a way that I think invisibilizes. I mean, it's just large cities and large coastal cities to represent something that's not really the full story, and that actually, when you start sort of scratching at that history, where we are sort of most concentrated, visible, obvious, associated with, there's always just sort of tendrils and connections across the country in all sorts of directions and across the world. And that there is some way in which like all these individual stories are like all of our stories. And I feel that as an archivist and feel that magic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we can go a little bit more into that. Jonathan, in Under the Southern Cross, I think you talked a little bit about your own experience as a trained historian coming into this work and diving into kind of doing archival work on the fly as you were starting this organization um ha- and because of that having a slightly different process than like standard kind of archival process, really looking at focusing on the stories, creating these collection guides around around specific stories or specific shared identities, etc. And there's a lot of there's a lot of similarities in the way that we do our work at the Historical Society too. I think that there's something very unique about both of these institutions, and also just like queer archives in general, most of the time coming out of really grassroots efforts, and out of usually like a really pressing need, right? Like I think we got started in the middle of the AIDS crisis, and it was basically let's dumpster dive and get all these things that were belonging to our friends and family before they're gone forever. So I was hoping you and Molly could talk a little bit about, what do you think are the unique aspects and also challenges of this kind of community grassroots focused archiving.
Right. What an excellent question. I think for the Faulker-Morgan Archive, we too began in a moment, I think, of need. Um, the Last Gospel of the Pagan Babies had just premiered. There had also been an exhibit at a private liberal arts college here in Lexington called Transylvania University, which Bob had curated, called I'll Be Your Mirror. So the premiere had happened, the exhibit had gone down, and it really was this, what now moment. Bob was being courted by archivists at just be honest, at the University of Kentucky Special Collections. They wanted his stuff. And of course, that's where I was a grad student. That's where I was earning my PhD. I knew all those folks really well, wonderful professionals. Um, and obviously very interested, but Bob was worried. Bob was worried about what it meant that it was a state-funded institution. What did it mean if the culture there changed? He was just leery. And so we had lunch at Max's Loudon Square Buffet. And he was telling me all of this, and he said, I think the best thing would be just to, and his exact phrase was, kick the can down the road for another 30 years or so, and then maybe it'd be safe. And he's like, would you take the stuff? And I, of course, was honored, but I said, don't bring it to me in boxes. I need to know what these things are. And so within a week, I was at Bob's. I took my little laptop camera, I sort of pointed it towards him, and he just started pulling out things. And so a photograph, a menu from a restaurant, letters, postcards, all kinds of good stuff. Artworks were really rich in visual images in the Faulkner-Morgan. And so I would take those home, and then based on the video that we had taken that day, that is how I cataloged the material he gave. And so in the collection guides, we time-stamped it that way. And I was just doing this for myself. I never thought that anyone else would ever actually see it. I was just doing it for my own selfish interests. And so that methodology became the way that we actually have done virtually every collection that we have taken into the archive. And so it puts the primacy of the story on the giver of the material. So we try to honor not only the story that they tell, but the way they tell that story, the way that the importance that they put on certain things. And it has been a really useful resource, especially with the time stamping, for folks to go back besides just looking at what was originally my collection guides, but now the guides written by our staff. Instead of just reading our short summation, they actually get to hear that person talk about this piece. And sometimes the photograph will come up and 30 minutes have gone by, and that person is still talking about that same photographs and the stories associated with it. And so that has been a really neat thing, a really neat intervention that we've been able to talk with archivists, keepers of material culture all across the nation. And it takes a lot of time, but it's certainly something that we have seen worthy of investment. And so when I think about the need, it was like, well, with Bob, it's like, I've got my friend Peter Taylor, who sued the university to recognize the first LGBTQ group in 1971, and outed himself to the entire state to do so. And it's like, what's going to happen to Peter's stuff? So we go and we talk to Peter. And then, of course, it just grew. And before we knew it, it was like, this has really outgrown what we had originally thought. So, we formed a 501c3. I'd already done quite a bit of nonprofit work. We've had some wonderful support. And it has been instrumental, I think, in a couple of ways. There are really two things that we want to achieve at the Faulker-Morgan Archive. One, we want to let LGBTQ Kentuckians know that they are a bright thread in the tapestry of Kentucky's history. The LGBTQ Kentuckians have always been here. They have thrived here. They have played roles in some of the most important moments of Kentucky history. And they have every right to be acknowledged, safe, and celebrated within the Commonwealth. And then the other thing we hope to achieve is for folks who aren't LGBTQ Kentuckians to know LGBTQ Kentuckians have always been here, and they're a bright thread in the tapestry of Kentucky, of the Commonwealth. Because it is, honestly, if you're familiar with your post-colonialist theory, strategic essentialism, you know, it can actually be kind of powerful to tell people you're from a Kentucky archive of LGBTQ stuff, because it sort of shocks the system. And it doesn't matter wherever we go, we always seem to suck the air out of the room when they hear that we're from Kentucky. And so it's because they don't expect it, right? They expect folks from New York, they expect folks from San Francisco. They don't expect, you know, John Coleman to roll up from Lexington, Kentucky. And so, you know, it's new and it's fresh. And best of all, it's a really compelling story that has profound impact on the lives of Kentuckians right now, and on the lives of folks who are interested in this story. So I think that's how, you know, the uniqueness, there's lots of stuff to say about, you know, the community aspects. It's so many stories are contested and, you know, within the community itself. And it's wonderful to have, you know, all of those sides represented within the Faulker-Morgan. It's great to see how many people believe their stuff should be in an archive. You know, some folks need to be convinced that their story is important, but a lot of people do not need to be convinced. They already know they're important, and they've just been waiting for the right opportunity to make sure that story gets saved. And so it's nice to see that. It's amazing to see. I deal a lot with history nonprofits, and sometimes they just came from an event. And I mean, I was, besides my staff and I, you know, the average was probably about 78 in terms of age. But when you go to a Faulkner-Morgan event, it's so young and it's so vibrant. Like there's obviously a need and a desire there. And it's really comforting to me, because I remember when that was me, right? When I was looking for resources like that. And now to be able to provide them in ways that are much richer and much fuller, thanks to the Faulker-Morgan and the work of the board, the staff, the volunteers, the donors, you know, that is, it's one of the great honors of my life. So it's a lovely thing to get to be a part of that.
Wonderful. Yeah, Molly, did you wanna share from the Historical Society side of things?
Yeah, that was wonderful listening to Jonathan. I'm moved. It's a wonderful story of that archive. Yeah, we were also founded as a community archive, as Lee said, 40 years ago in the midst of the AIDS epidemic. We started as a sort of offshoot of the San Francisco Gay History Project, which was a sort of informal assemblage of researchers who were interested in doing queer history work, but could not get, you know, any support or legitimacy for it in the academy. So sort of some of them were, I think, you know, getting PhDs, but sort of doing secret research on the side, or were pursuing their own projects sort of outside of higher education. And we began in a dining room. And we sort of incorporated or began our existence as like a dues-paying organization in order to pay $100 a month toward the rent, because the person whose dining room the boxes were in, his roommates demanded that they start paying he start paying more than an equal share, since the dining room was slowly being taken over. And as Lee said, was this sort of, I think, effort in a really painful and desperate time to record both things that were happening in that moment and the history of gay San Francisco, which, you know, went back in very visible ways many decades before that. And you know, I think the same forces that Jonathan is alluding to at the time, just disinterest and very calculated sort of ignoring from you know, both mainstream historians and mainstream sort of like historical knowledge generation structures, and I think continuing distrust for very legitimate reasons. And we continue to sort of have that relationship, I think, similar to what Jonathan is describing with in the story of Bob, where, sometimes we were competing with larger research university archival programs, and we try not to think about it as competing. It's like they're very good at their jobs and they're going to keep those things safe. But we often have people that come to us because I was talking to someone a few weeks ago who said, I want my materials to be there because I want it to be with our people. We're all there. And it was this sort of, and I think they're right, not just in this sort of like metaphysical sense of our materials being there, but also in the way the stories can be told and the reasons people come to us as an archive and the sort of stories they're looking for, the ways those stories can be told in sort of the context of the communities that the stories and the people that surround it. And just I think it's sort of existence in our collection gives it a different, whatever the word is, valence or sort of context in which to be understood. I think in some ways we face challenges or at least particular circumstances being in San Francisco and being called the GLBT Historical Society that can be challenging in their own ways. And I think because of the sort of moment we came out of even, there's a few things I think to say, like some of our first collections, our early collections were, the collections of the founders and of some of the founding members and early members, like Lou Sullivan, which is one of our most sort of frequently used collection, transmasc activist and historian, was an early member of the society and now is sort of his stories recorded there. But I think as sort of San Francisco gay history has become fairly well known, at least sort of in the abstract, there's stories that get told over and over again. And I think the other thing that is just true in San Francisco is there's a lot of wealth and there's a lot of really severe inequality across all sorts of demographic or sort of identity categories and extreme socioeconomic inequality as well. So I think there's a few things that sort of happen as a result of that. As an archive, I think over the past decade, over the course of our whole organization, to some extent, we've been working to sort of like broaden both like what are we collecting and understanding as queer history and as Northern California queer history, and then also like what are people, to the extent we have control over it, like paying attention to and what stories are out there and how can we broaden the sort of while being good archivists and not sort of putting our thumb on the scale too much, broaden the stories that are being told. There's ways in which I think we've been quite successful at, and ways that I think that's just a challenge in a lot of ways. So a lot of our work right now is trying to collect more stories and histories of immigrant communities and queer communities of color and trans communities and lesbian communities. And there's a real sort of geographic element here too. And I think because we exist as a nonprofit and a fairly visible nonprofit in San Francisco, that sort of, we're already like in a community with other nonprofits and other nonprofit workers and the sort of power structure of San Francisco and all of the, I'm going to say inequality that sort of is baked into that. Access to power across identity categories and, because of structural discrimination. It's very easy for us to collect a lot of things from San Francisco. And it's very easy to collect a lot of things from particular stories, and trying to get beyond San Francisco can be a challenge because we're not known there and we've not built trust there. So we're always sort of like, there's a way in which I think about it as like we're trying to stay as close to the community as we can and position ourselves in a place of like trust, and that we are treating people well, and that we are working from within community and sort of understanding ourselves that way, and also being really intentional about trying to like ever expand what that community is, because like a lot of lesbian history is not in San Francisco. There's plenty of lesbian history in San Francisco, but the East Bay has like a lot of gay history. Up north, we were talking about some, the back to the land movement in the 70s and 80s, which was hundreds of miles north of here sometimes. There's all sorts of gay history all over Northern California. It takes a lot of intentional work to sort of be able to tell those stories. And I sort of, approach this work with the knowledge those stories are out, like the belief those stories are out there, even if I don't sort of know what they are yet. And the sort of awareness that as an archive to be able to collect those stories, like it's going to be a little more work than just like, sort of like we have to expand our own vision of what's out there and who we might be needing to talk to, which is not easy, on as you can imagine, limited resources, small team, small budget, but this is sort of our endless work, is to try and keep broadening that sense of community and that sense of like who's included and whose history is our history.
Yeah, and well, and also like certainly, certainly also the fact that, being a geographically centered organization or a collection, collecting scope, like both of these institutions, you then grapple with questions of what fits within that geographical scope. Is, we see, C.D. Collins, came from Kentucky, lives part of the year in Kentucky, but spent 30 years in Boston, right? We have many people in our collections that, came to San Francisco from so many other places. Bob, what was it? Bob and Henry like went to Florida. So, how do we create these collections that are so based around this kind of geographical sphere, without like pigeonholing, to say, hey, this story is a San Francisco story, this story is a Kentucky story, and like those tendrils kind of all across. I don't really know if that's even a question, but just something that I was thinking about as you both were talking, is like all of these people that we're highlighting too are showcasing so many different experiences throughout the country, sometimes throughout the world, right? Like we have some pieces in our museum that are some images of Oscar Wilde on his trip to San Francisco, but we wouldn't necessarily consider that, San Francisco history that you would see in a San Francisco museum all the time. So Jean, I would love to chat with you a little bit. I want to I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your process working with John, working with the archives, and how you went about, either researching about these folks. I see, you've done a fair amount of oral histories as well. Or the very act of you, interviewing these folks for these films is part of creating an oral history, but also interacting with existing archival footage or materials to craft these stories.
Well, I think the first thing I would say is that when I first started talking with Bob for Pagan Babies, he he was very upset, and and his old friend Michael Thompson, who was a local actor and AIDS activist, had just passed away from complications of HIV. And Bob's sense of I think his own mortality and the mortality of the community he felt like was that the memory of these people was at stake. And in a way, we started working in a way that he was using the film project as a way of archiving and to remember these people's stories. And and he had also at the same time he was building these altars that had pictures of hundreds of young men, friends, people who he loved, but most of them at that time were had passed from HIV. And so in a way, he wanted for me to make a film that remembered the community, and which included, his generation, but also Sweet Evening Breeze and Henry, and other people. And so I think that archiving is really just grew out of that process because Bob, you know, John talks about Bob pulling things out from under his bed. I mean, he would, every time we would get together, you know, there'd be a box there that he wanted to, you know, and I'd take them back and scan them and, but you know, you can't deal with every story. I mean, Bob's got hundreds of them, but, so, so my process really was because I knew the community. I knew Sweet Evening Breeze, and I had hung around Henry a little bit, and and Bob and Bradley were friends, and so I kind of I knew what the scene was, and I knew how to ask questions or who to ask questions about. But so the 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 interviews and the footage, I mean, I've got, you know, got so much footage of Bob and Bradley talking and all that stuff. But it, for me, it was working very closely with Bob on Pagan Babies to identify, you know, there may have been a video shot of the thrusters. There may have been, you know, there was just kind of this common knowledge of what was out there. And so I basically had to hunt a lot of stuff down, and Bob provided a lot of visual, well, Bob and Bradley both provided a lot of the visual components of the film. So uh, working on Under the Southern Cross, which was a different matter, it was much more orderly working with John. And uh, uh, so that, you know, he of course made it very easy for me to access, you know, stuff about Henry. And so it was very haphazard in the beginning, and then working with the archive later was much more orderly. And then, you know, when I started working with on the Native Daughter, they had interviewed CD and had gotten a lot of her visual material. So, you know, it just basically landed in my email box, and I was able to work with material that they had plus what CD had. So so it's much easier now. So
Great. So just wanted to let everyone know we've got about 10-15 minutes left. So if anyone has anyone watching has any questions or comments, anything that they'd like to share or ask of our panel, please feel free to either put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we will happily ask them, or we'll get you off mute to ask your question. I wanted to ask, while we've got you up here spotlighted, Jean, what are some other stories or you know, people you're looking forward to documenting in the future, or anything that's, you know, in the kind of, you know, brain pan right now, because I'm sure that there's a whole trove of additional stories that are in the archive and out.
well, I don't have any immediate plans to add to the queer trilogy. Um, One of my projects that's been on the way back burner is a film about the Black Virgin icon. So I'm going to be starting to work on that here shortly. I don't have any pressing need to do another project right now. I think there is an interesting story to be told about Jill Raymond, and but I don't know if it's going to be me. But there's some. Do you all know about Jill Raymond?
Please
Well,
tell us.
John, why don't you tell them about Jill Raymond?
So Jill Raymond was they were called the Lexington Six or the Kentucky Six. And so about a year, this would have been I think she was imprisoned in 75.
Yeah.
But about a year or so beforehand, Susan Sachs and Kathy Power, who had been involved in some anti-war demonstrations, including robbing a bank in Boston, I believe it was Boston.
Yeah.
And one of their companions shot and killed a responding officer. And then these two women, they were lovers, they take off and they end up in Lexington, basically as part of the lesbian feminist movement here. And so they were drawn by a few things, but namely the Lexington was a real hotbed for anti-war activism in the late 60s, early 70s. You know, they burned down parts of the city, all kinds of really fun stuff happened. And Jill Raymond was part of the UK group called the Red Star Sisters, which was a lesbian socialist group. Kathy and Susan, who were here working under aliases, obviously were interested in that group and, you know, got involved. And, you know, it was just like two girls who just sort of wandered into town like so many others. But they had gotten word that the FBI had tracked them to Lexington, and they leave, and the FBI had indeed tracked them to Lexington. And so what started was really about 2 years of absolute torture from the federal government for Lexington, especially its lesbian community. So the FBI showing up, knocking on people's doors. In fact, one of the things we have in the archive is a pamphlet that a law group had produced. What happens if the FBI shows up, knocks on your door? Like, what are your rights? What can you do? What can't you do? And so they end up, this was something that Nixon's administration actually did quite a bit of back in the mid 70s. And so the FBI used the grand jury system because basically what they wanted to know about was really how networks of queer people, lesbian people, anti-war folks were communicating, how were they community building. And so Susan Sachs, by this point, had actually even been caught by the police. Kathy Power wouldn't get caught for like 20 some years. She went into deep hiding. She ended up marrying a man and she won a Betty Crocker Homemaker Award. But anyway, it was and what they did is they basically gave preemptive pardons to these folks. That way they couldn't claim the fifth. Because they're like, you know, you can't incriminate yourself because you've already been pardoned. And therefore, if they refuse to testify, which of course is protected under the Fifth Amendment, the judge would then hold them in contempt of court for refusing to testify. And so 5 lesbian women, 1 gay man, they go to prison for contempt of court until they agree to testify before the grand jury, even though all 6 of them still claim to this day they knew absolutely nothing. And Jill Raymond, she would stay in prison for 14 months. She actually outlasted the grand jury itself. Of course, now this is deemed to be highly unconstitutional. And so this becomes a huge touch point in lesbian feminist activism because the other women did eventually testify, and there was lots of concern about how much of this is personal sacrifice, like what exactly do you own to the movement? So there are national conversations that end up being built around Jill Raymond and her 14 months in various county jails in Kentucky. So fascinating story.
I love that. Yeah, there's so much of our history that is just so intertwined with like with carceral systems and the ways in which before our community had, you know, so much plain language out in the open that everybody you know, kind of coalesced around, that sometimes the only you know, records of queerness in existence are in these records of aberrance, these records of oppression and of being incarcerated and couched in, you know, terms like vagrancy and, you know, you know, being soliciting, etc. All of these things. We, you know, one of my favorite little bits in one of our museum exhibits is a little newspaper article of Jean Bonnet, the frog catcher, who was a person in the early 1900s who was arrested multiple times for wearing men's clothing, and she would frequently just say it's easier to catch frogs in trousers. And so, you know, we don't have really much in the way of knowing how this person identified, whether they were, you know, having, you know, their own trans experience, whether they literally were just dressing this way for economic opportunities and also for catching frogs. We don't know, but like their story exists in these like carceral legacies.
Right. And it's so, and there are so many similar things. One of the great things we have in the archive is one newspaper article from Muhlenberg County. I think it's from 1909, and the title simply says Aaron Bark was a woman. So Aaron Bark had just died in Muhlenberg County, and he'd lived in this county for 13 years, was known to be a good worker, really quiet, and then on his deathbed admitted that he was actually a woman named, I think it was Miss Green, something like that. And that's all we know. All we know is that Aaron Bark was a woman. And the way that these stories get connected, you know, like with Jill Raymond, it's as much about the feminist movement, it's as much about the anti-war movement as it is about their identity as lesbians. One of the early stories that we have, it's the first time the sodomy laws were actually, someone was tried under them in Kentucky. And it's actually two Black men from Western Kentucky, Poindexter and Moore, the Commonwealth. And so they were arrested for sodomy, and then their lawyer makes the argument, well, they weren't actually committing sodomy, the assumption being that they were having oral sex. And the Supreme Court sides with their attorney. They're like, gosh darn it, you're right. That's not actually sodomy. But we should probably change that law. But what's amazing about it is the fact that the Poindexter and Moore were two Black men, and they're in Western Kentucky. I forget, Kentucky has 120 counties, massive amount of counties for a very small state. But basically they were right in the heart of the Black Patch Wars. And so this had to deal with early Klan stuff and Black tobacco farmers. And so was their arrest part of retributions for the Black Patch Wars? Like, were they actually even having sex with one another? Although they do kind of admit that they were, like even in their argument. You know, were they being, was this a way in which, you know, white supremacists who were trying to basically monopolize the tobacco industry in Western Kentucky, was this a way for them to get rid of a couple of Black tobacco farmers? So yeah, all of those stories so quickly tie to other important stories of community and identity. It's nice to see that common thread.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're just about going to be wrapping up our time here, but we have a couple of questions from our spectators. One of them is the films, or specifically Last Gospel of the Pagan Babies, focuses really heavily on Lexington and really goes into the history of Lexington and why it was such a rich queer enclave, and the ways in which the queer community interacted with, you know, so many other communities, and you know, talked about like the football culture, the narcotics hospital. Robert Mitchell is wondering, are there stories from any other Kentucky centers that really pop out, or are there any other areas in Kentucky that mirror that kind of atmosphere that Lexington brought?
Well, yeah, no, truly, no. I mean, that's what's so astonishing. I mean, even Louisville, which is the larger city, you know, I'm not aware that there was a scene as wild and iconoclastic and, you know, just really out there, like in Lexington. I mean, John probably knows much better than I do, but What about Louisville, John?
Well, of course, so there are stories, the Faulkner-Morgan Archive represents queer histories from across the state. We actually have a really rich body from Eastern Kentucky, from Appalachia. And so I think what Jean is saying, Lexington, but there's a couple of ways I want to go here. Just like we were talking about earlier on, this sort of bicoastal, this idea that all the history happens there. We see that in the microcosm here in Kentucky too, that it all happens in Lexington and Louisville, which is also just not as true. It's kind of like me talking about when the University of Kentucky got sued by Peter Taylor. Peter Taylor had just moved to Lexington. He was from Little Whitley County, right? So it's really a Whitley Countyan. If you've ever been to Julius's Bar in New York City, Julius's Sip-In, have you ever heard of that important LGBTQ event? That was actually organized by a guy who had just moved to New York City. He just moved from Louisville, Kentucky, Dick Leish. And Dick's parents were involved in the civil rights movement in Louisville. Of course, a sip-in is a sit-in, right? Taken from Black civil rights leaders, the Black civil rights movement. Dick's parents had been involved. He knew how to organize a sit-in. So he went up to New York and he organized a sit-in, right? And he called it a sip-in. Just sort of changed, right, the community that he was fighting for. And so those barriers break down really, really quickly. Lexington, though, I think is unique in a couple of ways. One, Lexington has two major, well, I would say three major industries. A big one is education. So the University of Kentucky is located here, and they are the city's biggest employer. And of course, they bring in students, they bring in academics, all that great stuff. But the other two major industries are bourbon and horse racing. So all of which come with maybe a little bit of a laid back attitude, criminality maybe associated, gambling, drunkenness, all kinds of wonderful things.
Internationalism, international.
That's very true, yeah. So it's so I think there was a unique culture. Lexington is also sort of like the first major city for a lot of Appalachians. I myself am Appalachian. I'm from Eastern Kentucky, Pike County to be exact. And so it sort of, it sort of draws that sort of crew into Lexington. So there is a unique culture in Lexington that I don't think. Lexington is also extraordinarily dense. So there's what we call the Fruit Loop, which is basically downtown. And because Lexington is surrounded by the horse farms, which is a major part of our economy in Lexington, it has resulted in a really, really dense downtown that is simply not repeated in other urban centers around Kentucky, like Louisville. Louisville is very spread out. There's a lot of sprawl. And so you don't get sort of all your queer people living within, I don't know, 20 blocks of each other, it seems like. So, yeah, I think there is, of course, there's all kinds of amazing queer Kentucky history. And I also see, Robert, there that you asked, so the archives are open to the public. So, we are an archive. We're not really a museum, although we do a number of exhibits outside. In fact, we just got some grant money from the city to do our first kind of overall traveling exhibit called Here, Queer, and Everywhere. So excited about that. That actually we just premiered that in May, and it has now traveled, I think, to 4 or 5 different places. And then we work with a lot of other institutions to get our material out. I don't think the GLBTQ History Society has borrowed anything, but we've been like at the Leslie Lohman in New York, the Leather Archives in Chicago, and then a number of institutions within Kentucky.
Yeah. And then for the GLBT Historical Society, our archives are also open to the public if you make an appointment on our website. Molly can speak a little bit more to that. But you don't have to. I think it's also yeah. Molly put a link in the chat there. I think something that is unique to organizations like ours is that, you know, because we come from such a grassroots start, you know, you might find that in a lot of like academic archives, a lot of archival collections that are connected to institutions, a lot of times you'll get you know, restrictions on who can go in and peruse those collections. And for us, you know, you don't need to be part of any organization. You don't need to have a specific like research project or anything like that. Anyone can come and visit the archives. We just have you go on the website that Molly just linked to and just make an appointment. A lot of our collections are digitized, and then we have our separate location, which is the museum, which is open to the public 6 days a week. Just drop on in, or you can get tickets online, and it's like the tiniest fraction of what we actually have in our collections. And we wish we had all the space in the world to display them, which hopefully will be happening in the near future. And yeah, Molly, if you want to talk a little bit about just kind of, you know, what the process is coming into the archives, or anything you'd like to specifically highlight for folks, and then we can kind of wrap up and have everyone enjoy their Thursday night.
Yeah, just to sort of emphasize what you said, Lee, we're open to everyone. So we have just curious sort of researchers for their own personal interest coming in. Of course, we have academics, we have journalists, we have artists, documentarians, filmmakers, historical fiction writers, activists, all come in and use our archives on a pretty regular basis. And yeah, digital collections, both what's on exhibit in the museum and our digital collections represent like a small sort of fraction of what we have in our vault. So definitely come visit. And you can also see what we have in our sort of collection through that first link. If there's something you're curious about, you can always just write to us too over email. We do email reference, or we'll set up a Zoom call to walk you through stuff. We love this because this is how we get to interact with the collections. When someone is like, "Yeah, I have an interesting question I could use your help with," we need an excuse to spend our time doing that, so please give us that excuse. And yeah, as Lee mentioned, we have the museum in the Castro. We also have stuff that travels to different museums. We're pretty excited right now because we have a Sylvester outfit that's on display at the Met as part of the Black Dandy exhibit. So that's cool. And yeah, please come visit. And so wonderful to be here tonight with Jean and John and Leanne. Thank you all so much.
Yeah, thank you to everyone. I'm so glad that we got to have this conversation. And thank you to everyone who joined us. If anybody missed this, we'll be putting it up on our website. We'll put the recording up on our website, and we'll make sure that John gets it for Faulkner-Morgan. And we'll also, you know, look out in your email. We'll be sending just a follow-up feedback survey for our events. It's kind of our standard, to let us know what you thought about the program and what else you'd like to see from either institution. We'll share all of that information with John. And I guess we could just kind of close real quickly by you know, how can people best lend support to queer archives, queer artists and filmmakers in this time when there's so much attempt for erasure? What is the best thing that people can do and put their efforts towards in this kind of work, in supporting this kind of work?
Well, for as an artist, as a filmmaker, you know, contributions, you know, we have to really scramble for money, which makes things take longer. So support your local artist.
Yeah, money and vote. That's do those two things and I'll be grateful.
Yeah, I agree with that. A lot of the sort of funding infrastructure for archives is at risk right now with the elimination of the IMLS and just funding cuts there. So, and that impacts big organizations, small organizations, sort of all of us. I'm down to really, really small community projects. So, whatever we can do to sort of get that funding back, that is our taxpayer money that is going to support incredibly impactful and by any metric beneficial projects in our communities. So, yeah, that's number one.
Absolutely. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Jean and John and Molly, for this lovely conversation. I'm sure that this will not be the last. It's the first time, but it won't be the last time that our institutions collaborate, cross paths. Let's definitely chat about more ways to get involved with each other, because we gotta stretch that web across these arbitrary geographical boundaries, especially as we're all gathering together to remind people that, hey, we're here, we've always been here, and we've always been everywhere. So fantastic.
Thanks so much. This was a great program. I was really interested to see how you all pulled this off.
Well, thank you for providing the links to the films. Also, thank you everyone who witnessed the films. They'll still be, I think we still will have them up through the end of tomorrow. So if you haven't gotten a chance to watch one or two of them, you'll still have the rest of tonight and through tomorrow until whenever Jean pulls them down from
That's
the
right.
mail. But yeah, we hope that you have enjoyed this and look forward to more.
Thank you.
Bye everyone.
We'll see you.